Good morning, people at the C. Derek Varn channel. And today is more of a reflection than a rant. I made the mistake this morning of listening to the Skeptocrats, which is a atheistic podcast that's about politics, and it describes itself as from the far center. It spends most of its time shaming people who quote get their information from Chapo Trap House of the Young Turks unquote. Um, and mocking Trump supporters. Now, admittedly, after CPAC, there's a lot to mock Trump supporters with. I mean, you literally had a golden idol at the damn thing. And at the same time, you had them inviting people belonging to a Japanese cult because of a strategic arrangement with CPAC Japan, which is run by the Happy Science movement. If you don't know who they are, and I don't know why you would, you should probably look it up. But they're one of those fun groups that wants preemptive nuclear war with China. So, admittedly, there's a lot going on in the conservative world that's frankly bat guano. But I'm also hearing them make defenses of Biden that stretch credulity. They criticize people for getting mad that Biden gave up on the fight for 15. Now, admittedly, a lot of the left talking points of this are stupid. That I said early on Facebook that the fight for 15 being attached to the stimulus bill is going to be odd because it probably wouldn't meet reconciliation norms and because it was unlikely to pass. And Biden being a senator long enough to know Strom Thurmond when he was still a Democrat would know that. But it would get a lot of talking points and buzz up in the social media war from people like Nora Bolowski. They could talk about how generous and socialistic Biden actually is and how he's giving a whole lot to the left. He wasn't, and he isn't, and he never was going to be. And I suspect while the people at the Skeptocrats say that they will criticize Biden if he doesn't reverse the Trump tax cuts or if he doesn't end, if he doesn't continue the fight for 15, that we know that with Kirsten Sinema and Tim Manchin, there is no way the fight for 15 will get through the Senate. All those people who promised me, though, that Bernie Sanders, being a magical unicorn, would be able to do all kinds of flips and the budget reconciliation committees to make this stuff happen, of course, still neglect the dynamics that, structurally speaking, the most conservative Democrats are the strongest in the room. Furthermore, they made a defense of Biden's bombing of the militias in Syria. Now, it could be worse. Comparing it to Trump's actions is similar only in so much that they're probably against international law. But I mean, who listens to international law anymore? Almost no one does. But it's funny how much that's been normalized that doesn't even get a mention in liberal outlets where I read, frankly, centrist outlets like The Week that bring it up. And then you have paleo conservatives like Andrew Bashevitz indicating the problems there. And now you have Democrats defending it, which, I guess we should expect because we saw similar actions in in the Obama years. But what got me is when they started shaming, not that they shame their listeners for listening to Chapo or TYT. I mean, if you listen to TYT, it's on you, man. But that they started talking about preconceived notions and motivated reasoning as to why the left was getting wrong, while illustrating their preconceived notions and motivated reasoning for what they were leaving out of the picture of why people may be frustrated, even if their narrative for it is wrong. Of course, there's preconceived notions there, and of course, people's arguments are motivated. But what I've learned about people who bring up motivative arguments so much is they usually use it to hide their own. They have you focus on your motivation and not theirs. Most arguments are motivated. That's the way the human cognition works. Unfortunately or fortunately, it's the same reason pareidolia exists. We look for patterns that confirm what we think might be there. If you go paranoid, it gets worse. And of course, in conservative media, we have this going in spades right now in ways that make them seem more isolated from everyone else and more in their own corner. I am fascinated by this, but I'm fascinated by this for different reasons than most people, I suppose. I was thinking something else this morning, and maybe this is where the reflection comes in. Despite all the political commentary, for me personally, um, I spent a lot of the last decade outside the United States. In 2010, I was on slate to be laid off from my job. I had been accepted into a PhD program at Mercer University and secondary educational curricular development, and it was dependent on me continuing working. When my job ended, I had no funding, and there was no really means to get funding either. So I left the PhD program as well, resigned from my position so they wouldn't lay me off, which, believe it or not, was actually the better choice. And had a friend who had been a professor in Georgia, and actually one of my philosophy professors. He's a conservative gentleman. Reach out to me and get me an interview. And he told me where it was at after the fact. And so I interviewed at 2 in the morning via Skype when the internet was spotty. So I literally had to wait outside of McDonald's with Wi Fi in my car. Um, and I interviewed for a lectureship, not a professorship. Sometimes I confuse. Sometimes I'll talk about when I was a professor and people accuse me of being an adjunct. I was technically a lecturer. I was full time lecturer in the Department of Interpretation and Translation, focusing on educational studies. Hangoku de Hakyo. I worked there for 2 years and left after meeting the person who would become my wife. Um, I went through a lot of changes in this time period. Not only was I left the South, and I know people think because I traveled a lot in the last decade that I come from money, and I don't. All right, when I left uh, Georgia, and when I got laid off, I was literally working two jobs. I was working about 80 hours a week because I was working 50 hours at one job and working two other jobs, two adjunct positions at community colleges, which I like doing. I gained 50 pounds and I'd gotten well over 300 pounds. My my wife at that time, you can tell my history with women, right? My wife at that time had also been laid off during the recession. She and we had to leave our small apartment in Macon and live in the spare room of my parents' house for a few months. And my parents are not well off people. Um, the house that we grew up in is quite small. They still live in that house, and I'm not the only uh, child who had to go back. So I slept on the couch. Didn't sleep a lot because there was people awake all the time, um, and I was grateful for even that. I had moved out very early in my life, and my periods at home have always been brief, but like many people whose job instability and who was massively in student debt, sometimes when you don't have work, you do what you have to do. Now, I'm lucky in that I've never not had work for longer than 3 months, but this was that 3 month period. So I left and went to Korea. I was depressed. My marriage ended because my then wife told me she wasn't coming with me. And after I realized that I might not be coming back anytime real soon, that I would be on my own for a long time. And we tried to make it work for about 6 months. When I came back home for Christmas, we realized it wasn't going to work. It's too long. 2 year divorce process started. It took a long time because I was in another country. I was, and then I embraced my wife in South Korea. Started dating, dated about 6 months. Met my soon-to-be future wife. She was not the first person I dated, despite myths to the contrary. I probably should have stayed single for longer. Um, when we got together, we moved to a different place in South Korea, and I taught at an international high school, which paid a little better than the college gig that I had, and I also taught college at night there. It was actually part of the gig. Um, I did that for a year. I learned enough Korean to start feeling uncomfortable there, which I don't really want to explain deeply, but um, I gave up my scholarship on Korean American literature, which is actually what was working on. And I was in Korea, actually, advisedly. I didn't speak Korean before going. I don't speak it well now. Um, but I had studied a lot of Korean literature because I had Korean family. My aunt was Korean, and my cousins, two of them were half Korean and were often in and out of Korea. Due to the military, they were both in the military. Um, and I developed an attachment to the culture before K-pop and K-drama was common in America. In fact, at the time where I was at, there wasn't even a Korean restaurant. All those things were kind of just coming in at the end of the aughts. I actually think the rush of teachers to Korea at the end of the aughts, when a lot of Americans went over there for brief stays at hagwons, which are, cram schools, um, caused a kind of awakening of Korean culture mixed with Korean Americans showing interest in their home culture at about the same time. Um, Korea did a very good cultural campaign at the time, and I think it paid off. And the last year I was in Korea, Psy came out. Then I moved to Mexico. It was the end of the Zetas and the Lower Cartel War so it was not safe, but it was becoming safer when I was there. Mexico's dangerousness, though, to people who aren't super rich and who aren't super poor is overstated. Um, I was in a weird sweet spot where, like, I wasn't worth money to kidnap. I got paid in local currency and did make over $35,000 a year, which is not a bad living in Mexico, but, it's not worth kidnapping someone for. But I was an American, so it's a little bit too much heat to, like, mess with me unless I did something stupid, like get in the way of one of the gangs. So people got held up. They were forced to give bribes all the time, but we weren't really in that much danger. And I learned to love Mexico, despite the supposed danger there. And I lived in Torreon, which at the time had, due to its proximity to the Texas border, it was about 6 hours desert travel from the border, or it's about 6 to 8 hours desert travel from McAllen, Texas. Um, it went from one of the safest, most peaceful places in Mexico to one of the most dangerous. And it's just had to do with the Zetas encroaching on the Sinaloa drug cartel. Now, the Sinaloa, that's where El Chapo comes from. And for those who don't know, El Chapo, Trap House's namesake, that's what it's about. Operated more like the mob, where the Zetas, who had started off actually as a counter narco gang trained at the School of the Americas in my home state, Fort Benning in Georgia, had used the tactics they'd learned from from the training they got to fight counterinsurgencies, which they'd used the model of insurgencies in the Middle East and had applied that to their methodology in Mexico. And so they began to use campaign terror tactics to spread out as opposed to mob style hits. The mob style eventually won because its ruthless efficiency is actually quite effective. And when people root for you, since you don't kill people who aren't involved in the drug trade generally, um, it's kind of a good PR move. Whereas, I don't know, beheading people hanging from a bridge is not usually very popular, particularly when some of those people are random. But the bloodshed in northern Mexico was very, very high. I was already against the drug war, but it finished turning me against the drug war because that's what enabled these cartels to make so much money. since most of the drugs were going into the United States, although increasingly they were being dropped off in Mexico for a drug trade that was not there before NAFTA. Then I moved to Egypt, which was more politically unstable than Mexico, even though LCC had just taken power. There was all kinds of random changes. For a while, I was technically a undocumented worker while I had permission to be in the country. I did not have permission to keep my job, but I was encouraged not to quit by the government itself, which was a very weird scenario. So we were constantly worried that they would deport us at any minute. Particularly, I was worried about because that job was providing me for my insurance, and that insurance at this point was paying for my then second wife's cancer treatment. During this time period, my partner at the time had developed stage 4 melanoma. She'd had stage 1 melanoma removed in Korea. When we were in Mexico, she'd had skin checks and been fine. But a year into our stay in Egypt, and we were making good money in Egypt, we had to send her back. We were getting ready to go to a trip touring through Bulgaria and Southern Europe on our break because we finally had the money to do it. And we found a bunch of lumps in her lymph node, thinking it was an infection. Sent her to a doctor, and she lit up like a Christmas tree. Given that Egypt couldn't even maintain a steady stream of chemo materials at the time due to its devaluing of its own currency to float it by mandate, which has gotten much better and led to the development of some internal industries, but at the time led to sugar shortages, medicine shortages. It was a nightmare. The only reason I stayed is, again, my insurance was paying for my wife's treatment, and I couldn't give it up. Anyway, so we sent her to Wyoming, and then she started getting treatment in Salt Lake, and that's how I ended up here a year later. My job was cut at my school, but they were very good about it, and I wanted to go back anyway. When she started, I was preparing to never come back to the States because I was afraid that if the insurance didn't pay out, that I would be hundreds of thousands of dollars in lieu for my wife's treatment, which I did not have. To put it in perspective, the medicine she was taking for her cancer was literally $100,000 a dose, and even though they reduced it in cost for her for need, it was still $50,000 a dose, and she needed at least 6 doses. I knew I would never have the money to pay it off, and I didn't know if the hospital would pursue me for remediation. So I was prepared that if the insurance did not pay for whatever reason, and it was still questionable if it was, to never come back to the U.S. ever. And I had gotten in that mindset because her likelihood of surviving was really low. I tell you all this story to tell you that I went through a lot in those 8 years. And so COVID for me, the kinds of stuff that's happened during COVID here in America is more like a return to the kind of stuff I was living through at the time. But America was really hard on me. I came back and my marriage was hard to maintain. We bought a house, which added more pressure to us, even though we had plenty of money. I had spent years getting out of debt. Within buying a house, I was back in it. And my mother developed cancer as well during this time period. So I went back to my hometown, which is Macon, Georgia. And Macon, Georgia's seen better days. I don't want to disparage the good name of Macon, but when Macon comes up in reference obliquely, I've seen it referenced in the Boondocks. Terabell is probably Macon or Sparta, Georgia. If you've seen the Boondocks and know the Thugnificent plotline, it's been referenced by the Hay House and Borat. full of conservatives there, which is interesting because Macon is actually a majority black city, or pretty close to it. Um, but every time I go to Macon, even when the economy was good in the rest of the country, it was shrinking. Its economy kind of fell apart, and the first recession after 9/11, and had only gotten worse during the second recession. It was often voted one of the the first, second, or third worst places to live, trading places with Detroit and Stockton during the years of recovery when I was abroad. Um, so going back there is always interesting because half of the city that I grew up in and loved is declined and dead. And this is a lot of the fate of a lot of the South that isn't on military Keynesian spending. The South's support for military makes total sense because it literally keeps the economy floating in many of those areas. A place like Macon, surrounded by other places with military bases such as Columbus and um, Warner Robins nearby, saw its population shrink while those populations boomed. After all, I think Columbus is now the second largest city in the state. That's new. Augusta and Macon never had a military base. Augusta had one that had seen shortages and cuts during the last 2 decades, had both declined in the interim. That should explain a lot about why politics is the way it is in the South and why these paranoias and things come up, and also why the state is trending blue because it is both increasingly impoverished and increasingly black. But those contradictions are not dealt with very well by the situation of either party. Spending nearly a decade, honestly, I think I spent 8 years abroad, 7.5 years abroad. This round, and I spent time out of the U.S. earlier in my life too, through study and through family. When I came back, I had a hard time adjusting to being in America. I think that my depression probably mixed with my ex-wife's depression, me adjusting to being in the States, her surviving cancer, and adjusting to no longer being a world traveler, and also having complications that made her health bad. It destroyed our marriage, but not our friendship. We're still friends. I am telling you all this because in the last 3 years, I have increasingly become more used to the States. But it has changed my perspective on the U.S. and the U.S.'s identitarian, like it's the way community is substituted by politics and by ideational notions of abstract community as opposed to lived ones. Now, this can be taken in a very conservative direction, and communities can be very oppressive. Don't take me as romanticizing it, but there is a sense in which certain traits that are helpful in a community setting when you're trying to build something in a physical space with people that you have to live with on a day-to-day basis become harmful when it becomes an ideational space and you're not building anything concrete. And I think that's driving a lot of what we see in America, a lot of the excuses and the passing the buck. Conversely, I think America and the United States is dealing with what a lot of the rest of the world is dealt with, and it looks a lot more like the rest of the world. I feel like the stuff I see here is a lot more common in other places. Now, yes, being the hegemon means that Americans are more isolated and had less incentive to know much outside of their own borders, and in which case they also seem more provincial and frankly dumb. But this is something that happens to all hegemons. People talk about it with Rome, even. So it's not even a modern phenomenon linked to capitalism. It is a phenomenon linked to being, the dominant part of the area. It actually is this weird provincialism. And this is even true in like world cities like New York, where people can talk about how they belong to the city of the world and never leave the borough. I think we're finding that's ending. I'm finding Americans know a lot more about other places, although still not enough. Like if you tried to explain to them the history of the Pan, the Pre, and and Obrador's legacy to his family legacy to the Mexican Revolution center winning faction, and AMLO's spiraling in Jacobin. You get apology for the left in power, and every place else just ignores it. But in general, the ignorance of other places is ending as our hegemony is less and less relevant. There's a lot going on there. And I don't want to romanticize travel for you, because what made all this very world opening to me was not so much to travel, it was a way of life that I had to live in different places, which were much more communitarian. Egypt, each neighborhood in Egypt was far more, my neighbors knew me. And even though I was in a mega city, far larger than any city in the United States, my building was very enclosed. We knew who each other was. People watched each other's back. I knew the Boab. I knew the Boab's kids. I knew my neighbor across the hall. I knew the people at the local market who delivered my food when I needed it carried, because none of us had a car. Those kind of relations are sublated out in America, and for good and ill. And I think that leads to a lot of the derangement you see now. Perhaps that makes me more conservative than a lot of people like, but I'm just trying to be honest with you. And when I talk about alienation, that's what I'm responding to. Now, again, these communities have dark sides and downsides, and we've even seen it pathologized in our own community in the 80s and 90s. Everyone talked about, the picket fences, although the picket fences were far more isolated than any of these urban communities I lived with in South Korea, Mexico, or Egypt. And in fact, that's one of the ironies, is these were all urban communities. They were less alienated, and people had to interact with people of other classes more. And in America, it's just not true. All right. And that's my reflection for today. It's a little bit more inchoate than anything I would do, and it's a lot more personal. That's why I have this channel. Take care. Peace out. Don't let your ideological motivations fool you.